December 3, 1961, Eastern State Penitentiary, Pennsylvania. The concert ended normally, but what happened after Cash left the stage shocked everyone. Guard Captain William Foster, 20-year veteran, turned in his badge and walked out with the band. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? Foster had stood stone-faced through 1,000 incidents, but when Cash sang "I Walk the Line," something shattered inside him. His own son was doing time in another prison for a crime Foster knew he didn't commit. As Cash passed by, Foster grabbed his arm and whispered 5 words that would haunt the singer forever. Eastern State Penitentiary was America's first true penitentiary, built in 1829. By 1961, it was a crumbling monument to failed reform, scheduled for closure in 10 years. The cells were damp, the walls were cracking, and the revolutionary idea of reforming criminals through solitary confinement had long been abandoned as cruel. Now it was just another warehouse for human misery, holding 1,200 men in conditions that violated every modern standard. William Foster had worked there since 1941, starting as a 22-year-old rookie just back from the war. He'd seen everything: riots, murders, suicides, escapes. He'd been taken hostage twice, stabbed once, and had personally prevented more violence than he could count. Other guards called him the Stone because nothing seemed to affect him. No emotion ever crossed his face during work hours. But at home, Foster was falling apart. His son Michael Foster, 24 years old, was serving 15 years in Graterford Prison, 40 miles away. The charge: armed robbery of a jewelry store in Philadelphia. The truth: Michael had been working at that store, trusted with the keys, when his best friend Danny Marsh robbed it at gunpoint. Michael was found unconscious, pistol whipped, but the prosecutor argued he'd staged the assault, that he was the inside man. The jury believed it. Danny Marsh disappeared, never found, leaving Michael to take the full weight of justice. Foster knew his son was innocent. He'd raised Michael alone after his wife died of cancer. When the boy was 10, Michael was gentle, studious, planning to be a teacher. The kind of kid who brought home injured birds and cried at sad movies. Not the kind who'd rob anybody. But nobody cared what a prison guard thought about justice. Here's what nobody knew. Foster had been planning something desperate for months. He'd saved $17,000, his entire life savings. He'd mapped out routes to Mexico, researched extradition laws, bought a gun. He was going to break Michael out during a prison transfer scheduled for December 10th. It was insane, probably suicide, but Foster had reached the point where his son's freedom mattered more than his own life. Then Johnny Cash came to Eastern State. The concert was organized by the prison chaplain, Father Thomas O'Brien, who believed music could reach men that prayer couldn't. Cash had agreed immediately. Eastern State was legendary, and he wanted to play there before it closed. December 3rd was bitter cold, 15 degrees with snow falling. The concert was in the prison's center hub, where 7 cell blocks met like spokes of a wheel. They'd set up a small stage where the guard station usually stood. 1,200 inmates packed into the space, their breath visible in the frigid air. The heating had failed 3 days earlier, another sign of the prison's decay. Foster was assigned to security for the concert. He stood at his usual post, watching everything, feeling nothing, or trying to feel nothing. The letter from Michael was burning in his pocket. "Dad, I can't do this anymore. 15 years. I'll be 40 when I get out. My life is over." Cash took the stage at 2 p.m. Dressed in black, his breath steaming in the cold. He opened with Folsom Prison Blues, and the inmates erupted. Here was someone singing their truth, their frustration, their anger at a system that had caged them. Foster had heard hundreds of prison concerts over the years. They were usually painful, washed-up artists playing to captive audiences for easy money. But Cash was different. He wasn't performing at them. He was performing with them, as if he understood something about cages that free men shouldn't know. The third song was I Walk the Line. Stop. This is where everything changed for William Foster. As Cash sang about keeping his eyes wide open, about being true despite temptation, Foster heard something else. He heard a man singing about integrity in a world that punished honesty, about walking a straight path when everyone around you was crooked. Foster thought about his son, walking the line, being honest, working hard, and still ending up in prison. He thought about himself, 20 years of walking the line as a guard, treating inmates fairly, never taking bribes, never using excessive force. And what had it gotten them? His son in a cage, him planning a crime that would destroy everything he'd stood for. That's when the first crack appeared in the stone. A tear, just one, rolling down William Foster's weathered face. Jimmy Collins, an inmate doing life for murder, saw it first. Holy shit, he whispered to the man next to him. The stone is crying. Word spread through the crowd, like wildfire. Guards didn't cry. The stone especially didn't cry. Men who'd been at Eastern State for decades had never seen Foster show any emotion beyond stern disapproval. Foster tried to stop it, tried to rebuild his walls, but more tears came. 20 years of suppressed grief, rage, and desperation pouring out while Johnny Cash sang about walking the line. Cash noticed the commotion, saw men pointing at something. He followed their gaze to Foster, this guard in uniform, standing at attention while tears streamed down his face. Most performers would have ignored it, but Cash stopped mid-song. "Sir," Cash said into the microphone, looking directly at Foster. "You okay?" Foster wanted to nod, to resume his stone face, to pretend everything was fine. Instead, he shook his head. No, he was not okay. He had not been okay for 3 years, since the day his innocent son was sentenced. "Come here," Cash said. It was an insane request. Guards didn't interact with performers. They certainly didn't become part of the show. But Foster was beyond caring about protocol. He walked toward the stage, 1,200 inmates parting to let him through. When Foster reached the stage, Cash saw something in his eyes, not just sadness, but the specific grief of someone who'd lost a child to the system. "You got family inside?" Cash asked quietly, but the microphone picked it up. Foster nodded. "My son, different prison, he's innocent." The admission hung in the air like a confession. A guard admitting the system was wrong, that justice had failed. It was heresy in law enforcement. But the most shocking moment was still to come. Cash pulled Foster up onto the small stage. The warden, Paul Cave, stood up to object, but something in Cash's eyes stopped him. "What's your name?" Cash asked. "William Foster. Captain William Foster." "How long you been working here, Captain Foster?" 20 years. "And your son?" 3 years in Graterford. 15-year sentence. Armed robbery he didn't commit. The inmates were mesmerized. They'd all claimed innocence at some point, but hearing a guard, the stone himself, say his son was innocent, was different. It meant the system could fail anyone, even its own servants. "Tell us," Cash said simply. And Foster did. For the first time, he told the full story. Michael working at the jewelry store, trusted with the keys. Danny Marsh, the friend who betrayed him. The unconscious body. The missing money. The prosecutor who needed a conviction for re-election. The jury that didn't care about reasonable doubt. As Foster spoke, his voice breaking, the inmates listened, with a focus usually reserved for escape plans. This wasn't just a story about injustice. It was their story, told by someone on the other side of the bars. "I was going to break him out," Foster admitted, and the warden stepped forward, alarmed. "Next week, during a transfer, I had it all planned. Throw away 20 years of service, become a criminal myself, because the law I served my whole life failed my boy. The admission should have led to Foster's immediate arrest. Conspiracy to aid escape was a federal crime, but nobody moved. Even the other guards stood frozen, processing what they were hearing. Cash spoke carefully. "But you're not going to do that now." Foster laughed bitterly. "You sing about walking the line, Mr. Cash. I've walked it for 20 years. Never took a bribe. Never beat a prisoner who didn't attack me first. Never violated my oath. And where did it get me? My innocent son in prison, and me planning to become the criminal they say he is." He looked at the inmates. "You all know what I am to you. The stone, the guard, who never bends. But I'm breaking, men. I'm breaking because the system I upheld is crushing my boy." An inmate in the front row, Thomas Professor Barnes, serving life for killing his wife's lover, stood up. "Captain Foster," Barnes said, "you treated me fair for 10 years, never called me anything but my name, never used your stick unless I swung first. Your boy's innocent." "As God is my witness," Foster replied. Barnes looked around at the other inmates. "This man's been straight with us for 20 years. If he says his boy's innocent, I believe him." Others nodded, murmuring agreement. The stone had earned their respect through 2 decades of firm but fair treatment. Here's the detail that changes everything about this day. Cash made a decision that would have legal ramifications for years. He pulled out a piece of paper and pen from his guitar case. "Captain Foster, I want every man in here to sign this. A petition, 1,200 inmates saying they believe your son is innocent based on your 20 years of integrity." It was unprecedented. Inmates petitioning for someone they'd never met, based solely on the word of a guard, but they lined up to sign. Murderers, thieves, rapists, men's society had written off, putting their names on a document for the son of their captor. As they signed, each man said something to Foster. "You stopped that riot in '58, saved my life. You got me to the infirmary when I was stabbing myself, made them save me. You never lied on a report, even when it would have been easier." Foster stood on that cold stage, watching his prisoners become his advocates, and completely broke down. 20 years of professional composure shattered entirely. But wait, the most extraordinary moment was approaching. Warden Paul Keeve, a progressive reformer who'd been trying to humanize Eastern State, made an announcement. "Captain Foster, in light of your service and this unprecedented show of support, I'm going to personally write to the governor about your son's case, and I'm going to include this petition." The inmates cheered, actually cheered for a guard's family. Cash wasn't done. "Captain Foster, what was your son studying before this happened?" "Music education," Foster said. "He wanted to teach kids music, had a scholarship to Temple University." Cash made another decision. "When he gets out, and he will get out, I'll make sure he gets to finish that education. That's a promise." Foster fell to his knees. The stone, the immovable guard, was on his knees on a prison stage, sobbing, while Johnny Cash held his shoulder, and 1,200 convicted criminals stood in respectful silence. Then Foster did something that stunned everyone. He stood up, walked to the edge of the stage, and began removing his uniform, his badge first, then his cap, then his jacket. He laid them carefully on the stage. "I can't do this anymore," he said to the warden. "I can't be part of a system that cages innocent men. I'm done." He turned to the inmates. "I'm sorry. For every time I had to lock you in those cells, knowing some of you might be innocent too, for being part of this machine. I'm sorry." Stop. What happened next had never occurred in American prison history. The inmates began applauding, not mockingly, but with genuine respect. They were applauding a guard's resignation. Yes, but more than that, They were applauding a man choosing conscience over career, son over system. Foster walked off the stage in his undershirt, no longer a guard, just a father destroyed by injustice. As he passed through the crowd, inmates patted his shoulder, shook his hand, offered words of support to their former captor. Cash played one more song, I Walk the Line Again, but this time he changed the lyrics. I keep my eyes wide open all the time, watching for the innocent locked inside. Because they're mine, I walk the line, for every father's son doing unjust time. Because they're mine, I walk the line. When the concert ended, Foster walked out with Cash's band. He left Eastern State Penitentiary after 20 years, carrying nothing but the petition with 1,200 signatures. Here's what happened in the aftermath that changes everything. The petition reached Governor David Lawrence's desk within a week. Along with it came letters from Warden Kiev, Johnny Cash, and remarkably, the Catholic Archbishop of Philadelphia, who'd heard about the event from Father O'Brien. The pressure was unprecedented. A guard, with 20 years of spotless service, testimony from 1,200 inmates, and celebrity attention. The governor ordered the case reviewed. The review uncovered something explosive. Danny Marsh, Michael's supposed accomplice who disappeared, had been arrested in Chicago 2 weeks after the robbery. He'd confessed to acting alone, said Michael was innocent, but the Philadelphia prosecutor had suppressed this information to secure a conviction. Michael Foster was released on January 15, 1962, after 3 years of wrongful imprisonment. The reunion between father and son was covered by newspapers across the country. The photo, William Foster, no longer the stone, crying while embracing his freed son, became an iconic image of justice, delayed but not denied. But the story doesn't end there. Johnny Cash kept his promise. He paid for Michael Foster to complete his music education degree at Temple University. Michael graduated in 1965 and became a music teacher in Philadelphia's poorest schools, where he taught children whose parents were often in prison. William Foster never returned to prison work. He became a private investigator specializing in wrongful conviction cases. Over the next 20 years he helped free 17 innocent men, using the same methodical attention to detail that had made him the stone. The 1,200 inmates who signed the petition became part of legal history. It was cited in multiple cases as evidence that prisoners could show moral judgment and solidarity beyond their crimes. Several judges noted that if 1,200 convicted criminals could recognize injustice, perhaps the justice system needed reform. Professor Barnes, the lifer who first stood up for Foster, became the leader of Eastern State's first prisoner advocacy group. He wrote to Foster regularly, and Foster visited him every month until Barnes died in 1978. At Barnes's funeral, Foster was the only non-family member allowed to speak. This man was labeled a killer, Foster said at the service, but he helped save my son's life with his signature and his voice. He showed me that good men can do bad things, and men who've done bad things can still do good. The guard who'd stood next to Foster during the concert, Patrick O'Malley, was so affected by what he witnessed that he quit 2 months later and became a public defender. He said watching Foster break made him realize he'd been complicit in a broken system. Eastern State Penitentiary closed in 1971, but the music room they created after Cash's concert remained active until the end. The inscription above the door read, "In memory of the day, the stone cried and 1,200 hearts answered." Cash wrote about that day in his autobiography. December 3, 1961. I've played 1,000 concerts, but I never changed a life as dramatically as the day I pulled William Foster onto that stage. He thought he was just a guard doing his job. The inmates thought he was just the stone. But when he broke, when he admitted his son was innocent and the system was wrong, he became something else. Proof that conscience can overcome conformity. that love for a child can shatter any walls we build around our hearts. In 1985, Foster and Cash met again at a criminal justice reform conference. Foster was now a nationally recognized expert on wrongful convictions. He stood at the podium and said, "Johnny Cash saved 3 lives on December 3, 1961. My son's, by creating the petition that freed him. Mine, by giving me the courage to leave a system I could no longer serve. And the soul of American justice, by proving that sometimes the criminals see innocence clearer than the courts." Michael Foster taught music for 40 years. He estimated he reached over 10,000 students, many of whom had incarcerated parents. He always told them the story of the day 1,200 prisoners, and Johnny Cash saved his father's soul and his own life. Music, he would say, can break chains that no key can open. In 2001, 2 years before Cash's death, Michael organized a concert at Graterford Prison, where he'd been wrongfully held. Cash, though ill, insisted on performing. During the concert, he brought Michael on stage. "This man spent 3 years here for a crime he didn't commit," Cash told the inmates. His father, a prison guard, broke his 20-year silence to save him. 1,200 inmates at Eastern State signed a petition for someone they'd never met. That's the power of truth, recognized and spoken. Then Cash said something that would become his epitaph on criminal justice. "The line between guilt and innocence isn't as clear as prison walls make it seem. Sometimes the innocent are inside, and the guilty are free. Sometimes guards need freeing more than inmates. Sometimes the system we serve becomes the crime we commit." William Foster died in 2004, 1 year after Cash. At his funeral, attended by hundreds, including many former inmates, from Eastern State, Michael read a letter his father had written, but never sent to Cash. "Mr. Cash, you asked me to come to that stage, and I thought I was just another face in your crowd. But you saw me breaking and gave me permission to shatter completely. In that shattering, I found myself. I walked the line for 20 years, but you showed me sometimes the bravest thing is to step off the line entirely and walk toward truth instead." The petition with 1,200 signatures is now in the National Museum of American History. Next to it is Foster's badge and uniform, donated by Michael. The display is titled, "The Day the Guard Walked Out, Conscience Over Conformity." Every December 3rd, a small group gathers at the abandoned Eastern State Penitentiary, now a museum. They're former inmates, former guards, and families affected by wrongful conviction. They sing "I Walk the Line" and remember the day when a guard's tears brought down more walls than any riot ever could. The guard station where Foster stood for 20 years has been preserved. Visitors often report feeling emotional there, though they don't know why. Tour guides tell them, "This is where the stone cried, where a man chose his son over his system, where 1,200 criminals proved they had more integrity than the courts." In 2019, DNA evidence definitively proved Danny Marsh acted alone in the jewelry store robbery. He died in prison in Chicago in 1988, taking the full truth with him. But Michael Foster had already been free for 57 years, thanks to his father's courage and 1,200 signatures. The last surviving inmate, who signed the petition, James Red Morrison, died in 2021 at age 93. His final interview included this: "I killed 2 men in 1947. Did my time, never denied it. But watching Foster that day, seeing him admit the system was wrong, seeing him choose his boy over his badge, that was the first time I understood redemption. Not forgiveness for what you did, but courage to do what's right, even when it costs everything." This is the story of the day a concert became a confession, a guard became human, and 1,200 condemned men became instruments of justice. The day Johnny Cash didn't just sing about walking the line, but helped a man step off it to save his son. The day the stone cried, and the walls of institutional silence came tumbling down. Foster had grabbed Cash's arm as he left and whispered 5 words, "You saved my son's life." But Cash knew better. Foster saved his own life by choosing truth over 20 years of investment in a broken system. The inmates saved Michael's life by seeing past the uniform to the breaking father beneath. And Michael saved thousands of lives by turning his wrongful imprisonment into a lifetime of teaching music to children who needed hope. The line Foster walked for 20 years was straight and narrow. The path he chose that December day was harder, toward truth, whatever the cost. Sometimes walking the line means knowing when to step off it entirely. That's what William Foster learned the day Johnny Cash sang him into shattering, and 1,200 prisoners helped put him back together as something new, not a guard, not the stone, but a father who chose love over law.